Chapter 5. By unspoken agreement, all three of them stayed awake the rest of the night, even though Maxwell was safely imprisoned and Brother Shepherd and his zombie army were gone. It would have been impossible to sleep in any event. The caged zombie battered tirelessly at the door to its prison. At first, Gibbons had wanted to go straight to the reanimated corpse and examine him. But after Fox and Jett objected forcefully, and Jett threatened to knock her in the head if she tried, she finally agreed to let the zombie be. Not because she thought Jett would knock her unconscious, but because after about half an hour of watching the creature, she realized that if she got anywhere near it, it would have a very good chance of killing her. It wasn't fast, and it was clumsy, but death seemed to have granted Finley Maxwell an unholy strength. So they settled as far away from the thing as possible, and mostly to try and keep Jett's mind, and truth to tell, her own, off the horror trying to claw its way out of the cell. She asked about the one thing she was pretty sure Jett truly cared about. Your stallion, he's, well, remarkable is an understatement. Did you train him? I've never seen anything like him outside of Liberty horses in a circus. My brother and I had him and his sister from the time they were suckling foals, Jett said slowly. Nightingale and Lark. They were bred from a fancy stud out of Arabia as our birthday presents. I was to have the filly, of course, and my brother the colt. We'd been reading about knights, not the King Arthur sort, but the crusader kinds, and how they'd trained their horses to fight with them, and we thought that was a champion idea. We saw the Liberty horse acts with traveling circuses too, and our head stableman agreed to let us train them as we wanted, so we pretty much started training them before they were even weaned. Aha, Gibbons said, enlightened. Yes, the old knights, particularly the Germanic ones, made their horses into weapons. I can see now what you did. But how is it you have the stallion now? When my brothers went off to fight, nobody thought we'd lose, Jett said bleakly. You don't send the horse you intend to be your foundation stallion off to war. If Lark was killed, we'd lose maybe 8, 10 foals at most. But if Nightingale died or was taken, we could potentially lose hundreds. So my brother took Lark, and I got Nightingale. Jett paused, and the silence continued long enough for Gibbons to be sure there was something painful about it. The Yankees didn't get him. It's about all we had they didn't get. Quickly, Gibbons spoke up to turn Jett's thoughts back to something happier. So tell me more about how you train them. I know very little of horses. As she had hoped, horses, or at least Nightingale and Lark, were Jett's passion, and she was more than willing to wax eloquent about how she and her brother had turned their mounts into something so remarkable that foolish people might start pointing fingers and whispering about witchcraft. It was more than interesting enough to keep Gibbons from thinking too closely about the horror on the other side of the jail. Even White Fox found it interesting enough to add some tidbits about how Indians train their horses. But at last the sky turned from black to gray to blue, and in the first moment of true daylight, Finley Maxwell's body dropped to the floor, lifeless once more. I want to take a look at him, Gibbons said decisively. She'd managed to bottle her feelings back up and put them where they belonged, out of the way. There was no place for feelings in science. Jett shook her head, but made no other protest. She got to her feet and picked up Gibbons's coach gun. Here, she said to White Fox as she handed it to him. This will be a darn sight more use than your pistol. Despite that, Gibbons noticed Jett kept a hand on the butt of one of her colts. For that matter, Gibbons wasn't nearly as sanguine as she wished to appear as she picked up the ring of keys and advanced on Maxwell's cell. He certainly looked dead. More dead, in fact, than he had the night before. Of course, by now he'd been dead longer, and while he didn't have any bruises from the hours he had spent trying to batter its way out of its cell, the struggle had left the body looking a bit more beat up. Gibbons unlocked the door and stepped inside, then knelt down beside the body and placed the back of her hand against its cheek. It was cold. She felt for a pulse in both neck and wrist, because no matter what she'd seen outside the jail last night, Maxwell's condition might stem from some natural cause. Datura, among other things, could cause both the frenzy she'd witnessed and the near coma that had followed it, and Jimsonweed, or loco weed, was a common local plant. But if the former Finley Maxwell still possessed a pulse, it was far too weak for her to find. Gibbons thought he probably was as dead as he looked, but science was not a venue in which to entertain guesses and suppositions. First, she'd identify his condition beyond doubt. Then, if he was dead, she'd start searching for what had reanimated his corpse. Because if corpses were being reanimated, She wanted to know how. Jett watched approvingly as Gibbons relocked Maxwell's cell. There was no point in taking chances. She'd been as scared as she could ever remember being last night, but with the return of daylight, Jett had other things to worry about. "I'm going down to the livery to see if the horses are still there," she said, picking up her Stetson. She glanced back at the provision-laden cell as she moved toward the jailhouse door. "I suspect it will be for the best if we continue to sleep here," White Fox said, seeing the direction of her glance. "Didn't do much sleeping last night," Jett commented sourly. She lifted down the bar, securing the outside door. As she swung it open, there was a faint sound, and a piece of metal fell free. The creatures battering at the door last night had torn the facing plate of the lock set from the doorframe. "But I don't think they'll be coming back somehow," she added, and stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk. When Gibbons and White Fox joined her, they could see what she'd meant. Overnight, Alsop had been transformed from a deserted town into a devastated one. Most of the street-level windows were broken. Doors stood open, and some of them had been wrenched completely from their frames. There'd obviously been substantial and systematic looting. "My auto-tachopode," Gibbons gasped. She took off at a dead run for the livery stable. Jett and White Fox were only a few paces behind her. When they got there, it was empty both of zombies and of horses, but the auto-tachopode didn't seem to have been touched. While Gibbons examined her machine for signs of damage, White Fox and Jett examined the stables. "They carried off most of the oats," White Fox said, gesturing toward the back of the barn. "But they left the hay, the blankets, the carriage, Gibbons's conveyance." "Hay would take up too much space, I think," Gibbons said, emerging from the inside of her wagon. She frowned in puzzlement. "And the auto-tachopode does not look particularly valuable. If one is not aware of the treasure of science its form conceals. But there are no signs they even tried to break down its doors. Certainly I would have expected them to at least try to get into it." "Are you bragging or complaining?" Jett asked. "Just as well. Your buggy may be our only way out of here now." "Our horses weren't taken," White Fox said. "They fled. We may hope they will find their way back to us soon." Jett nodded without speaking. If Nightingale could, he'd come back to her. "I should have stayed here with him, or brought him into the jailhouse," she thought, even though she knew either course would have ended in disaster. The zombies had been all over Alsop last night. She couldn't have escaped them again, and even if she had, Brother Shepherd had been here too, and probably armed. She might outrun a zombie, but she couldn't outrun a bullet. And Nightingale would have given them away for sure if he'd been in the jailhouse when Finley Maxwell came back from the dead. All she could do now was hope the miraculous luck that had kept the two of them alive for so long hadn't run out. Gibbons disappeared inside her wagon again, emerging with a bulging carpet bag. "We must make a detailed search of the town," she announced. "But that can wait until after breakfast. Any drinking establishment worth its salt served food. Beans and eggs, or plates of stew, both accompanied by sourdough biscuits, were common fare. Most saloons served as tavern, restaurant, and hotel, and sometimes even as courtroom and hospital. But in Alsop there was a restaurant and rooming house next door to the saloon. A well-beaten path between their back doors proved that food went one way and beer went the other. Despite the depredations wreaked in most of the town, the rooming house's kitchen had escaped essentially untouched. White Fox speculated that the looters were interested mainly in bulk provisions. As Gibbons stoked up the huge cast-iron stove, Jett went to inspect the general store for additional supplies. It had been looted, and much of what remained had been smashed or ruined, but she found an unbroken bag of Arbuckles and some cans of Eagle brand in the wreckage. At least there'd be coffee and milk to go in it. Good thing Gibbons stocked up on bullets when she did. There sure aren't any here now, or firearms either. She no longer wondered what zombies would want with things like iron frying pans and bolts of cloth. The question was, what did Brother Shepherd want with them? Over flapjacks, beans, and coffee, Jett got the chance to ask that question. White Fox had carried one of the tables into the kitchen area. The smoke from the chimney might be seen at a distance, or more likely smelled, but anyone riding into Alsop wouldn't see anything but the broken window of the dining room. "So Brother Shepherd can make zombies somehow," Jett said. Gibbons nodded reluctantly. "You were right after all, Jett. And what I need to do is..." Jett held up her hand so she could finish. "And he took over Alsop, killed everyone here, turned them into zombies, then came back to loot the place." "Why?" What's he get out of it besides the chance to lord it over less than 100 people? Perhaps that is sufficient, White Fox said in doubtful tones. No, it can't be, Gibbons said urgently. Think, both of you. He has discovered some method by which he can cause the dead to rise up and follow his orders. That secret could make him a rich and powerful man. Except for the fact he's crazier than a day-struck owl, Jett said. I don't think the bank was touched last night, but even if it was, there can't be more than a few $100s there, and that's figuring in the paper money too. If Brother Shepherd was to use his army to hold up a stagecoach, there wouldn't be a lawman in the territories who could stop him. Or he could hit the assay office in Denver. There isn't a desperado alive who doesn't dream of lifting that cash box. Gibbons looked thoughtful. A herd of cattle is worth a great deal of money, but only if one can get it to the railhead in Abilene. I don't think zombies, from what I've seen, make very good cowhands. If we assume Shepherd is behind the disappearance of the trail drive, he must have taken them for a reason beyond personal enrichment. To keep Sheriff Mitchell from looking into all those people who went missing, like you said, Jett said, and Gibbons nodded. But surely he could have found a simpler way to discredit the sheriff, Gibbons pointed out. White Fox, you spoke of disappearances north of here, and far beyond anything the Yell and Cry has reported. We know people have been vanishing for at least 2 years, and that's only within a few hundred miles of Alsop. You mentioned disappearances on tribal lands even farther away. And according to you, Jett, Shepherd is telling his congregation his blessed resurrected will soon be sweeping across Texas and the territories, doing much what they did here in Alsop. He'll need numbers for that. So I think he's been experimenting up until now. The prospect of an army of reanimated corpses sweeping through the West, killing everything in its path, was enough to cause all 3 of them to fall silent. White Fox was the first to speak. Throughout the meal and the discussion that had accompanied it, he'd been looking more and more troubled. At last he reached into his shirt and pulled out a beaded buckskin pouch. Most people called them medicine pouches, but Jett had one herself. Plain or fancy, they were used as often to hold tobacco and small valuables as for any kind of Indian magic. White Fox extracted an oilcloth bundle little larger than a deck of cards from the pouch. I promised Caleb Lincoln I wouldn't show this to anyone, as its disclosure could get him and his family into trouble, White Fox said. He unwrapped the bundle, revealing a small handmade book. Its leather covers were stained and worn. His mother sent this to him in her last letter. It was why he was so anxious to see how matters stood at Glory Rest. He told me it was a treasured family heirloom, and said I was to return it to his mother if I found her and his family safe and well, and to rely upon it for help if they were not. A prayer book? Jett asked in disbelief. It was the size and thickness of the breviary her mama had conducted the Sheridan family's evening prayers from. Gibbons plucked the book from White Fox's hands and rifled through it. Its pages were covered edge to edge in cramped time, faded writing. No, she said. A spell book. Someone who knew of Gibbons's love of logic and her devotion to science would find it odd that she was as familiar with the principles of sorcery as she was with the principles of physics. But such was the case. While many disciplines were freighted with such a weight of past ignorance and historical irrationality that rendered new research difficult if not impossible, others could be considered as useful records of phenomena observed, but imperfectly understood. As such, these parasciences were able to illuminate many aspects of the physical world. I see now why Trooper Lincoln warned you, Gibbons said as she skimmed the small volume. This could be quite inflammatory in the wrong hands. I can't see how a spelling book could be trouble, Jett said, grabbing for the book. Gibbons twisted sideways, holding the book out of Jett's reach. Not a spelling book. A spell book. It's a grimoire, she said. A manual of conjure. Jett recoiled as if she'd been told the little book was made of red-hot iron. Conjure is folk magic, Gibbons began pedantically. 1 part Dahomean Vodun, 1 part Catholicism, 1 part Indian practices, and 1 part folklore. You don't have to tell me what it is, Jett snapped. You think we never knew about the dances they held down at. Then don't behave as if I'm suggesting you take up Satanism, Gibbons said irritably. Jett sat back with an aggrieved sigh. What does it say about zombies? She asked after a pause. I have no idea yet, Gibbons said, brandishing the book in emphasis. It took only a quick glance to tell what the book is, but it will be another matter entirely to extract actual information. Everything has been written down in bits and pieces. I'll need to comb through the entire text to see if there's anything about zombies, and if it's of any use. I suppose I might be some help with that, Jett said reluctantly. I can help you match it up with what I know anyhow. Gibbons smiled at her radiantly. Thank you. That will be very useful. But first, she said, getting to her feet and tucking the little book into the pocket of her pantaloons, we must search the town for clues. Jett sat on the corral fence down at the livery stable, her boot heels hooked over the center board. The sun was high, and heat haze danced and shimmered, blurring the horizon. There wasn't much to see, anyway, just desert, and more desert, from here to the Rio Grande. 2 days without sleep had begun to take their toll, and Gibbons had ordered her to take herself off to rest. Jett had been too weary and heartsick to rip up at Gibbons about her high-handed dictates, but she didn't rest either. She went back to the livery. This morning the three of them had spent hours searching every building in the town, and all they'd found were new mysteries. Jett was more than familiar with the look of a place that had been looted by an invading army. Alsop didn't look like that. Even if you assumed zombies couldn't climb stairs, they'd had plenty of time to cart off everything at ground level Brother Shepherd could possibly want, and smash what could make trouble for him. Gibbons expected to find the telegraph lines down. Jett expected the bank to have been robbed. Gibbons was right, the lines were down, and the machinery had been smashed, but the bank was untouched, much to Jett's surprise. Most of what had been taken was food. Food for livestock, food for people. Anything available in bulk that could be easily carried away. Maybe a few other items, but while it was obvious the general store and the livery had both been hit hard, the destruction made it less obvious what was missing, particularly in the case of the former. And the destruction looked to have been caused by accident rather than intentionally. Jett had thought she'd be able to get White Fox to track the missing horses after that, but Gibbons had a long list of errands she wanted him to run. Gibbons had decided to make the saloon into her base of operations, and Jett had helped carry all the broken furniture into the street, then swept the saloon floor clear of sawdust and scrubbed it down with lye and water. It wasn't much cleaner than it had been when she started, but at least the bloodstains had been bleached away. But there was plenty more fetching and carrying that Gibbons had in mind, and Jett didn't really have the heart to drag White Fox away from that task. She was afraid of what he might find. If Nightingale had been panicked enough to gallop until he was winded, he might have broken his leg or his neck. He might have run into a Comanche scouting party. Alsop was on the southern border of the Comancheria, but since the whites didn't honor the border, the Comanche saw no reason to either. He might have been killed by the zombies after all, or shot. Or he could be down by Burnt Creek this very minute wondering where the devil I've gotten to. She told herself irritably. She'd go and check. Only Burnt Creek was a day's walk from Alsop. It was only a few hours away by horse, but she was fresh out of equines. And Gibbons didn't seem inclined to take her steam buggy out for a spin. Right now she and White Fox were busily converting the saloon into something Gibbons called her laboratorium. Whatever that might be. She'd promised to help Gibbons with her research later, but Jett wasn't convinced Gibbons needed help, not hers at least. The thought of stepping back into the jailhouse with the zombie gave her a cold grue, let alone the thought of facing a whole army of the things. This isn't my fight. It's nothing to do with me. I'm looking for my brother. Philip needs me. If I don't look for him, who will? Jett tilted her Stetson further down over her eyes and sighed, wishing she were anyplace else. Only you can't run out on White Fox and that fool Yankee, and you know it. If she's right about what Brother Shepherd is planning, he won't leave anyone above ground from the Mississippi to California, and that includes Philip. If I couldn't convince Gibbons until she saw for herself, I sure can't convince the United States Army. So, suddenly a dark splotch appeared in the heat shimmer of the horizon. Jett stuck 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled shrilly, hoping her eyes and her heart weren't playing tricks on her. But a moment later Nightingale came trotting toward her, Deerfoot behind him. She jumped down from the rail, and a moment later she was running her hands all over him, neck and chest and legs, looking for injuries as Nightingale tried to grab her hat. He finally succeeded, gripping the brim in his teeth and pulling it off her head as she laughed and grabbed for it. "You fool nag. Don't you know I was worried sick about you? Where have you been?" She rose to her feet and swung an arm across his withers. As Deerfoot trotted past her, Jett turned to look up the street. White Fox was standing outside the saloon. He'd obviously heard her whistle. She blushed hotly. He'd heard her slopping nightingale all over with sugar like a girl. To the world, she was Mr. Jett Gallatin, gunslinger, card-sharp drifter. She had to remember that. It didn't matter if she slipped up here and now, but she wouldn't always be surrounded by folks who knew the truth. Maybe someday, she thought wistfully, when I've got Philip back, when we settle down somewhere. White Fox led Deerfoot back in Jett's direction. She stepped away from Nightingale to retrieve her hat, and the stallion followed her, nudging at her hopefully. You think I carry sugar around with me all the time on the chance you'll turn up? She demanded gruffly. She dug around in her pockets until she turned up a piece. Having received his treat, the stallion turned away and walked sedately into the barn, obviously expecting breakfast. Fool, Jett repeated and followed him. She'd tossed some hay into the stall Nightingale had chosen and was looking around for a water pail when White Fox entered the barn. They seem to have taken no hurt, he said. Once we have tended to their needs, Gibbons requests your assistance. Jett restrained herself from snorting in derision. It didn't seem to her that Honoria Gibbons needed anybody's assistance with anything. But less than an hour later, Jett was standing in the saloon gazing at a makeshift map tacked to the wall of the saloon. It had been assembled from pages removed from an atlas and showed Texas and a good bit of the territories. All of Kansas and part of Nebraska, west into Utah and Arizona. There was a bright red wax pencil X to mark Alsop, and a number of smaller XS, in pencil both clustered around Alsop and dotted across the rest of the map. Crossing the map from east to west were 3 meandering pencil lines. Jett wasn't sure what they were. Wagon train routes? Cattle drive trails? This is why I wanted your help, Gibbons said. She crossed the room holding an open atlas in her arms, obviously the one that had been sacrificed to create the map. I hoped if I charted all the disappearances, the pattern would tell me something. Anything you can add will help. I can tell you plenty about disappearances east of here, Jett said. Don't need to wonder why they went missing, though. Show me. Gibbons walked over to the bar and set down the atlas. Don't assume you know why someone disappeared. I'm looking for a pattern. Jett stepped closer to the map and peered at the penciled marks. Now she could see there was a date written faintly beside many of them. Each of these is where somebody went missing, she said, puzzling it out. She frowned. Isn't that one going to Mexico? She asked, pointing at the southernmost of the 3 jagged lines. What are they anyway? Railroads, Gibbons said succinctly. And that isn't Mexico. Sure looks like it to me, Jett said. She pointed at a word at the bottom of the map. Mexico. Says it right here. Gibbons gave an annoyed huff. It might say Mexico, but it isn't Mexico. These pages are from an old atlas. That area's been part of the United States for 4 years. Says who? Jett scoffed. Says Mr. James Gadsden, the United States ambassador to Mexico. That's who, Gibbons said. He bought it from Mexico. Must have cost him a pretty penny, Jett said. She inspected the map for a few more seconds. Those aren't railroads. There aren't any lines west of Kansas. Not yet, Gibbons said, sounding even more annoyed. But there will be. There are already telegraph lines. The railroads will follow. And the first transcontinental railroad will take one of these 3 routes. She gestured at the map. Which one? Jett asked with interest. This one, Gibbons said, pointing at the center line. The Union Pacifics laid track almost all the way across the Sierra Nevadas, and they won't stop there. The Central Pacific is coming west. They're going to meet the Union Pacific halfway. Well, if they've already made up their minds, why put in all 3 of them? Jett asked. Because you don't need just one railway line, Gibbons said. And the Central Pacific still might go south. Everybody's worried about snow on the central route. No snow in Texas, Jett agreed. Don't know what railroads have to do with zombies, though. Probably nothing, Gibbons admitted. But the more information we can collect in one place, the more likely we'll see some connection. And of course there are more settlements along the path of the railroad. Whether it's there or not, Jett pointed out. It's going to be there, Gibbons insisted. And that's why towns are being built along the route. Being on the railroad line means faster growth, better transport. If you order something from New York or even Chicago, it can take 3 months or longer for it to get here by wagon. Or for something from here to get there, White Fox pointed out. Now that the railroad has reached Abilene, the ranchers drive their cattle there to sell. They, too, are becoming wealthy from the railroad. Jett turned to him, looking puzzled. Too, she asked. The railroad companies must purchase the rights of way before they can lay their track, White Fox said. Those who own land along those rights of way stand to enrich themselves greatly. Or be left holding the bag if they guess wrong, but that isn't pertinent to our current problem. Gibbons said briskly. She advanced on Jett, flourishing a pencil. Everything you can remember, please. By the time Jett had charted every disappearance she'd ever heard of, the shadows were beginning to lengthen. She'd added 20 or so possible locations to the map, and White Fox had promised to send a message to Fort Riley to see what he could add as well. Gibbons had suggested they spend the night in the jail once again, since it was the safest place to be if the zombies returned, but Jett had flatly refused. The moment Gibbons had opened the jailhouse door, the zombie had flung itself at the door to its cell, reaching through the bars in a vain attempt to reach them. The three of them spent the night in the livery stable. Gibbons's contraption seemed like a good place to hide if the zombies returned. The next day was devoted to something Gibbons apparently considered even more vital than making a record of the missing and figuring out just why Brother Shepherd felt the need to create a zombie army to slaughter the wicked. Something much at odds with Brother Raymond's insistence that the Fellowship of the Divine Resurrected was completely opposed to violence just to begin with. Jett and Gibbons spent the morning combing through Trooper Lincoln's little spell book for useful information. To Gibbons's indignation, there wasn't much in the grimoire about zombies. Jett already knew what didn't kill a zombie, which was what Gibbons seemed to want to know most, so she'd cudgeled her memory for everything she remembered from the ghost stories Tante Mare had loved to tell her and Philip. The only specifically zombie-related information she'd been able to come up with was that you could kill one by feeding it salted porridge with a silver spoon, and certainly that seemed as if it ought to work, considering the salt-free meal she'd enjoyed at Jerusalem's Wall. Despite her vigorous ridicule of Jett's silly superstitions, Gibbons had sacrificed one of her own silver spoons to experimentation, and at high noon, when the creature lay as if dead, they'd put a bowl of salty porridge into its cell. The two of them returned a little after dusk to see whether it had worked. "It's as dark as the inside of a goat's stomach in here," Jett muttered, breaking the silence. Gibbons snickered as she walked over to the lantern. "I suppose you." Suddenly there was a sharp thud, and the cell door rattled. Gibbons jumped in surprise and dropped her tin of matches. The rattling continued as she retrieved the matches and lit the lamp. In its soft glow, Jett could see that the zombie was on its feet again. The porridge was untouched, and from the creature's behavior, the only thing it was interested in devouring was them. "You're wearing a cross, are you not?" Gibbons asked as they regarded the zombie straining to get at them. "Yes," Jett answered slowly. "Rosary, anyway." "It's got a cross on it," she added, since she knew Gibbons wasn't Catholic. "Is it, blessed?" Gibbons asked awkwardly. Jett nodded. Gibbons held out her hand, and Jett slipped it over her head and handed it to Gibbons reluctantly. "What are you?" she began. "Hey!" she yelped as, to her horror, Gibbons strode purposefully toward the cell. "Hold it still," Gibbons demanded as the zombie flailed wildly at her. "How?" Jett demanded, but she gritted her teeth and seized the zombie's outstretched arm. It didn't feel alive, despite the fact its owner was flailing around like a gigged frog, and Jett groaned in revulsion. Fortunately, she didn't have to hold on for long. "Let go," Gibbons cried a moment later. She jumped back, with Jett's rosary swinging from her fist. The touch of a blessed object will break a curse. Apparently, Gibbons meant to try all the things Jett had told her until she found something that worked. Jett let go of the zombie's arm and staggered back clumsily. Its fingertips grazed the front of her shirt in the instant before Gibbons yanked her out of the way. She grabbed at Gibbons to keep from falling and was surprised to discover Gibbons was shaking. "Why, she's just as scared as I am," Jett thought, watching Gibbons charge right up to the cell. It hadn't occurred to Jett she was seeing bravery and not idiocy. She may be a damn Yankee, but she's got grit when it counts. "Are you all right?" she asked hoarsely. "It didn't work," Gibbons said in frustration. She took a deep breath. "Never mind. I'll find something that will." By now they were standing in the open doorway once more. Jett stepped out onto the sidewalk. I still don't see why you're worrying so much about figuring out how to kill them, anyway, she grumbled. White Fox and me can ride back to Jerusalem's wall and drag Brother Shepherd out by the ears. Or just ride out to any of the big spreads around here and tell the boss who's got their cattle. And what if stringing him up, since I doubt the cattle barons will turn him over to the law, just sends his zombies on an uncontrolled rampage? Gibbons demanded. What if it doesn't? Jett answered crossly. Even though that makes just as much sense, since I am currently without facts on which to base a theory, that only means Brother Shepherd's discovery, whatever it is, remains at Jerusalem's wall for anyone to use. It isn't enough to discover he's behind this if we have no way of destroying his zombie army. Jett sighed. Guess you might be right. Gibbons had the uncanny ability to make raving lunacy sound like absolute common sense. What do we do after we kill off all his zombies? The more times she said the word, zombie aloud, the more peculiar it sounded. Why, we search his laboratorium, of course. It is impossible to imagine he doesn't have one, Gibbons said optimistically. The zombie rattled the bars of its prison, and her smile dimmed just a bit. She pulled the door closed behind her and followed Jett onto the sidewalk. Here, she said, holding out Jett's rosary. Thank you for loaning it to me. Jett took it with a twinge of reluctance, even though she knew Gibbons had only touched the zombie with it briefly, and tucked it into her pocket. I shall think of something, Gibbons said firmly. I know it. Gibbons stared morosely at the makeshift map pinned to the wall of the saloon. White Fox was out hunting, in hopes of adding some fresh meat to their diet, and Jett had gone up to the graveyard to acquire some graveyard dust, another of her folk remedies. Gibbons didn't think it would be any more successful than the others, but she had to try it anyway. She was glad she was alone right now. She hated to fail, and she was currently out of new ideas. If the graveyard dust doesn't work, the only thing left is to pray over the creature. Though I don't have any idea what prayers to say over a zombie. We don't have either garlic or roses, and anyway, Father said they were for use against vampires, so I can't try those. And all of these things are sheer hoodoo, besides I know they are. She chewed on her lower lip, glancing from the notebook in her hand to the map on the wall, then made another careful X on her map. It was too old to show most of the recent towns, and individual homesteads wouldn't have been indicated anyway. But White Fox had drawn careful maps of his information, and she was following them now. If she couldn't solve the most important problem, at least she could collect more data. Brother Shepherd has to have used modern methods to create his legion of undead, she thought, glaring at the map in frustration. He certainly isn't a hoodoo doctor. I even have a sample of his work. I should be able to deduce his methods and counteract them. She added the last marks to the map, and then blinked at it in surprise. There is a pattern, she realized excitedly, and the spark of discovery was enough to make her temporarily forget her other problem. It's obvious, she said, waving her fork toward the map on the wall. White Fox had returned with a brace of rabbits, and while they'd been cooking, Jett had taken her pouch of graveyard dust down to the jail and sprinkled it over the unmoving body in the cell. Gibbons had spent that time rechecking every site on the map. She didn't want to share her discovery until she was sure it was true. Well, Jerusalem's wall is here. Makes sense, most of the disappearances are here too, Jett said. They're not just here, Gibbons said. They're there. She gestured toward the wall again. Clear as mud, Jett muttered. No, White Fox said. Gibbons is correct. The disappearances aren't centered around Jerusalem's wall, as one might expect. They follow two routes, the cattle trail north and the Southern Railroad route. There isn't a Southern Railroad. You said so, Jett pointed out. But if the railroads did use the Southern route now, they wouldn't have to pay to secure right-of-way, Gibbons said triumphantly. He hasn't cleared all of it yet, but I suspect he intends to. And if there's no one there, no one can claim ownership of the land. No, White Fox said, sounding sad and troubled. Before I left Fort Riley, General Custer said the Comanche have resumed their raids north of the Comancheria. They would not do that without reason. They're being shoved north by other hostiles, Jett guessed. The Apache, Wichitas, and Mescalero are clearing out. Now we know why, Gibbons said in satisfaction. This isn't about preparing for some Jerusalem of fire, and it isn't killing for killing's sake. It's about luring the railroads to build on the southern route because they can do it for free. And I'll bet you anything that when they do, This brother shepherd is going to file claim to as much land on both sides of it as he can grab. And once he owns the land, he can ask any price he wishes for it, White Fox said. He'll make a fortune. I bet he's got. Jett snapped her fingers as she tried to think of the word, undated deeds of claim on file in Austin. Once the railroad goes through, he gets someone to backdate his claims. If the land's empty, who's going to argue? And so he's chosen to kill or terrorize everyone in its path, White Fox said, with an army of undead. So which came first? Jett asked. The zombies? Or the fellowship of the blessed resurrection? That, Gibbons said thoughtfully, is a very good question. White Fox couldn't decide how a task that had seemed simple, if dangerous, had become so large and complicated in less than a week. The more they uncovered of the cause and reason for the destruction of Glory Rest and so many other settlements, the less they seemed to know. And so much of it was guesswork. They knew the settlements were being attacked by undead creatures. They knew the man calling himself Brother Shepherd was involved. Beyond that, what they truly knew was less substantial than a handful of wind. And if I hadn't had the luck to meet both Jett Gallatin and Honoria Gibbons, I wouldn't have known even that much. I would have been among those who died here 4 days ago. So many chance events had combined to save him. His decision to stop at Burnt Creek to watch over Gibbons. Jett's arrival with the warning about Alsop. Gibbons's preparation of the shelter that had saved all of them. He knew the Wasatch placed little credence in omens or guardian spirits, but White Fox had to believe they had guided him to this place to do their work, and more than that, had given him allies any warrior would be proud to fight beside. Gibbons's unflagging bravery as she searched for the truth. Jett's courage in facing her fear and allying herself with them for a cause she had no stake in. He stepped out of the telegraph office, a salvaged basket full of neatly rolled tapes under one arm. Gibbons wanted to go through the messages sent to Alsop to see if any of them might contain another scrap of information. Alsop hadn't had a telegraph office for long enough for the received messages to become a nuisance. The basket was only half full. He was about to return to the saloon when the sound of a gunshot shattered the quiet. He turned toward the sound and saw a tin cup balanced atop the fence post of the livery stable corral spin into the dirt. As he walked in that direction, 5 more shots followed in quick succession, and 5 more targets disappeared. Before the last one hit the ground, Jett dropped the empty pistol into its holder and tossed her second Colt from her left hand to her right. Her long black frock coat swirled as she moved, and 6 more targets followed the first. "What are you doing?" White Fox asked when he reached her. "Practicing," Jett answered. "Nothing else to do while Gibbons is making up her mind about what to do about Brother Shepherd." She gestured toward the jail. "And trying to kill our house guest." She holstered the second gun and went to gather up the plates and dishes and set up her targets again. "And how long do you intend to continue practicing?" White Fox asked. "Making too much noise for you?" Jett asked, pausing in the middle of setting a cup on the top of the fence. "I could go out by the church and practice there." "No," White Fox said. "I only wonder, why?" Jett tossed the cup to the ground and leaned back against the fence post. She folded her arms across her chest, regarding him steadily beneath the brim of her black Stetson. The impersonation was a good one. They might have ridden the trail together for some time before he suspected the truth. "This rig-out saves me a lot of problems," she said, gesturing at her clothes. "But if I can't back up the tale I'm telling, well. A hard life, spent always at war," White Fox said. "I didn't start the war," Jett said sharply. Her words turned his into something he hadn't intended. "The war is over," White Fox said. "Don't you think, Jett?" "White Fox, I think I've figured out where I went wrong," Gibbons said, running up to them. "Do tell," Jett said, digging into her pocket for bullets and beginning to reload her guns. "I thought I was on the wrong trail when we tried the porridge," Gibbons said excitedly. "But now I don't." "It didn't work," Jett said, spinning her gun's cylinder before dropping it into its holster. Her hand was still full of bullets. "It didn't eat it," Gibbons said. Jett began to load the other gun. "So, you're going to walk in there when it gets up tonight and hand feed it?" she asked neutrally. "Don't be silly," Gibbons scoffed. "That would be unduly reckless. But the 3 likeliest methods of destroying a zombie all involve salt. Porridge has salt, and so does graveyard earth." "Sure," Jett answered. "Depending on the graveyard, I guess," but the river's plenty brack around New Orleans. I guess that means the stuff I dug up today won't work. We must wait for tonight in order to rule it out, I think, Gibbons said kindly. The third method involves having the zombie ingest blood from an, obviously still living, close relative, but that will be impractical as we don't know any of Finley Maxwell's family. But my point is that all three folk remedies involve salt. Blood is quite saline, as I'm sure you know, so once you eliminate the obfuscatory trappings of rank superstition, it's clear that it's the salt that's the important part, not any of the rest of the mumbo-jumbo. White Fox carefully suppressed a smile. Jett and Gibbons engaged in a constant war of words, bickering much as sisters might. He wondered if either of them even suspected their growing friendship. Obfuscatory trappings of, Jett said slowly. She spun the second colt around her finger and dropped it into place. Superstition, Gibbons supplied helpfully. I know you grew up with zombies, Jett. Jett choked and began to cough. Gibbons moved forward to pound her on the back, but Jett waved her off. No, you just go on, I'm fine, she said in a strangled voice. But these creatures don't seem to be anything like your zombies. You can stop going on as if I grew up with a hope chest stuffed full of the things. Jett protested. I don't think Mr. Shepherd is practicing hoodoo at all, Gibbons continued, ignoring her. I think he's some sort of scientific necromancer. Jett groaned faintly. And if you are right and salt will kill one, what do you propose? White Fox asked. I want to see her hand feed the varmint, Jett muttered. You will, Gibbons promised. But only if this doesn't work. Perhaps it would simply be best to burn it when morning comes. White Fox said quietly. The building now reeked of decay, the cloying scent of rotting meat underlain with a sharper, more poisonous scent. In the light of the lantern, all three of them could see the thing in the cell hadn't been destroyed by the graveyard dust. If anything, it seemed even more energetic. And lose the chance to find out what actually kills one, Gibbons demanded. No. At least we know something else that doesn't, Jett said in disgust. She nodded toward the cell. Pretty darned lively for something that hasn't had food or drink in 5 days. That's why I think it may not be exactly dead, Gibbons said seriously. I know what you saw, I saw it too. But if the process puts the creatures into some sort of animate coma, which might well explain the drop in temperature in their presence. For should this process lower their temperature to unnatural levels, proximity to one would be akin to proximity to 100 weight of ice. But I digress. If Brother Shepherd's scientific necromancy does not create true death, but a deep coma, it would explain the chanting we heard that night as perhaps some form of control. Individuals in a state of coma later recount entire conversations that took place at their bedsides, you know. That's because they're in bed to hear them, not marauding across the Llano Estacado, killing everyone in sight, Jett pointed out. And it sure as anything smells dead. Obviously the two cases aren't entirely identical, Gibbons said hastily. But let us see what tomorrow brings.